So First Amendment, well, in schools and all that, I mean, I said it this morning, I'll say it again. I hope to convey that this is inclusive of private schools as well, but of course, the First Amendment anxiety level is much higher in public education. And I also would say, contrary to the reputation that it has because of litigation and culture wars, I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing because I think that the First Amendment has given us, when we use it and when we apply it properly, it has given us a strong arrangement in public education that really allows us to learn how to deal with one another, negotiate differences, learn about one another. I mean, we couldn't be teaching about religion if it weren't for the First Amendment, and we couldn't, or we would be promoting one religion over another like we did early in the public school history and so forth. So the First Amendment is key to our American arrangement. There it is. It's only 45 words, so incredibly short. And the first 16 of which we'll spend a little time with are sometimes called the religion clauses and Supreme Court opinions. They really are not the religion clauses. They are the religious liberty clauses, but they're called the religion clauses. I say that because it's not about protecting religion or just for the religious. The religious liberty clauses are about every human being's inalienable right to freedom of conscience, what Roger Williams was concerned about. Only 16 words, which is extraordinary how brief that is, to create this arrangement in freedom, a religious freedom. Can you imagine a bunch of lawyers drafted this? Can you imagine asking them to do that today? To draft something on religious freedom? It'd be volumes, 16 words. Must have been before billable hours, that's all I can say. Right? So, 16 words. Now what's striking, I'm just going to pause on these 16 words for a minute. Congress shall make no law. Well, what strikes me about that, well, why should I tell you what strikes me? What strikes you about that? Yes. Tell me your name because I haven't identified your name. Bonnie, okay.
First of all, if it said Congress gives you the right, anything that's given can be taken away. And so what Congress is, or what the clause is saying is Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Basically what they're saying is that you already have this right, it's yours, it's God-given, it's unalienable, whatever you want to call it. And Congress shall make no laws to abridge that in any way, to take away from your already unalienable right.
Bonnie, do you teach this stuff? Well, you must be awfully good in that classroom. I like that, and that's exactly right. It's better than I could have said it, so I'm glad I asked. Right, that it takes it off the table. But it is, as Bonnie says, a recognition that these are not rights being granted to us. A lot of people say, oh, you know, the First Amendment gives us certain rights. Actually, that's not quite accurate. I know what people mean. The First Amendment recognizes we have them. And that's deeply important because I get a lot of foreign visitors coming to the museum. And, oh, I'll get your question in a second. I'll just finish my little anecdote, my little cute anecdote, and then I'll call on you. But I get a lot of foreign visitors to the museum, and they almost always ask me things like, well, we're thinking about revising our Constitution, or we have a new Constitution. What rights do you think we should give people in the Constitution, right? They always ask it. And of course, I know what they mean. But I think they also maybe are asking, you know, what do we give people? Do we give them free speech? Do we give them this? And I say, well, from the American side point of view, if you're asking me, it's not the question we would ask. The question would be, what rights do you recognize that people already have by virtue of being human beings? And then we can talk about what rights do you want to protect in your Constitution? The Universal Declaration of Rights protects a whole host of rights. It's not a legal document, but it's a vision for freedom, human rights. The Bill of Rights protects certain ones. Madison was not anxious to have a Bill of Rights, as some of you may know, because he thought, well, if you enumerate the rights, you're not going to have, others will not be protected.
Well, that's the Ninth Amendment that we just talked about at lunch. You know, the Ninth Amendment basically says, just because we didn't write it down doesn't mean
Yeah.
it's not your right.
Yeah, that's a Madisonian gesture. He wrote, his first draft was 17 amendments and whittled down to 12, which went to the states, as many of you probably remember, and 2 didn't make it. If they had, I would be working for the Third Amendment Center, but I'm not. I'm working for the First Amendment because the first 2 didn't make it. So we bumped up. This bumped up from being number 3 to being number 1. Yes, you wanted to ask me something or say something.
I think I just, in thinking about especially our discussion earlier this morning, wouldn't we be remiss to also not think of this within specific context in which it was written, specifically that this is very much a reactionary document to British colonialism and the rules that were imposed upon it?
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of the Bill of Rights echoes those concerns in that time. And again, Madison thought, well, you know, the Constitution doesn't give the federal government powers over these things, so why should we mention it? They don't have it. If you mention it, they may think they have it. So, but Jefferson wrote and said, no, the people must have a Bill of Rights. The people deserve a Bill of Rights.
And also, the Constitution only applies to the federal government. It did not in any way apply to the states, which is why we have all these court cases that incorporate.
Right. Right. So that's the second point to make about these first opening words Bonnie just made is so important because Congress no longer means Congress, as you probably know. And most Americans understandably don't get this nuance because it's been there, this change has been there for a long time, this doctrine of incorporation that Bonnie's talking about. It starts in the early 20th century, but the religion clauses don't get incorporated. It means the Supreme Court doesn't recognize that these rights of the religious liberty clauses apply to the states through the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment cases are the ones about that we've had since the doctrine of incorporation. So all First Amendment cases are really 14th Amendment cases when it involves public education, for example, of the states. So you see in the court decisions, they always talk about the 14th Amendment and then go on and talk about the First Amendment, but they get it out of the way. It's like, okay, through the 14th Amendment, we're applying the First Amendment. Because, interesting footnote, there's one justice on the Supreme Court that disagrees with the incorporation of the Establishment Clause as a fundamental liberty that the states cannot interfere with. Just to say, 14th Amendment, you might remember, Due Process Clause. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or a property without due process of law. And the word liberty, the court lifted out and said, that means free speech, free press, and so forth. So they used the words of the 14th Amendment. Whether the framers of the 14th Amendment intended this or not is a debate. They used it in the beginning of the 1920s to say all levels of government now are subject to the limitations to this, limitations on government that this states. So the Establishment Clause was incorporated in the late 40s, and there's one justice who doesn't believe that's right. Current justice, you can guess who it is.
Thomas?
Yes, of course, Justice. What are you answering for?
No idea.
You know, you're so into it, you're just going to pop out with the answers now. Yes, Clarence Thomas.
I want to clarify this. Are there examples of state laws or cases where the First Amendment was violated at state level prior to the 14th Amendment?
Oh, well, no cases because the 14th Amendment didn't apply. So we don't have First Amendment cases applying to in the states
I guess
until later.
okay. I guess I'm like a little bit confused because I always understood the 14th Amendment as kind of like clarifying and buttressing something that already existed.
You can see you can actually call the Civil War amendments for shorthand a new constitution, and you'd be pretty close. It's like a new constitution. And people think, oh, we had the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and then we added a few things. But really speaking, these Civil War amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment, change everything.
But isn't it like the 10th Amendment says anything that's not listed in the first 9 amendments is up to the states to figure out? The implication is that the things that were in the first 9 amendments should be followed, whether they are or not.
No, but it's because they fought over this. Madison wanted this to apply to the states. He lost. He wanted to apply it to everywhere because he was for disestablishment on all levels. He lost that battle, and he settled for this. But you know who could, and this is where Justice Thomas points this out. Justice Thomas says when this no establishment language was added, guess what? Massachusetts and Connecticut had established faiths, like I said this morning. So if you were from Massachusetts and Connecticut, you'd say, hey, I'm for this. Congress can't interfere with the establishment in my state. I can keep it. And Thomas says that's right, because it's not a fundamental right, no establishment. It's a limitation on government, and therefore it shouldn't be included in the list of liberties that through the 14th Amendment have been applied to the states. That's an argument. And others would argue, well, no, these two clauses are inseparable, and they give us religious liberty together, and together they're a fundamental human right, and that's the prevailing argument. But he's separating out and saying, no, if some of the framers supported this and voted for this because they thought the state should be able to establish whatever religion they wanted to, then that's the original intent, and that's what we should go by. And he doesn't believe you can incorporate that under the 14th Amendment. But he's the only one. I mean, and I think that's after 60 plus, almost 70 years of incorporation and having the Establishment Clause apply to everywhere, all states, and all levels of government, city halls, public school teachers, everybody, this applies. After all that time, I don't think the court's going to go backwards and say, oh, you know, Alabama, you want to establish the Baptist church? Go right at it, do it. Well, Justice Thomas would say, well, if they want to, they can. They can do that. Now, there are state constitutions that prohibit establishment, too. Some of them are more stricter than this has been interpreted, because they were adopted at a time when the anti-Catholic fever was so high in the United States that they made entering states pass these very strict provisions of separation of church and state. No penny of government money shall ever go to any religious institution under any circumstances, ever, 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 ever. And what they meant was never give money to the Catholics. That's kind of what they meant. You know, and they passed... They passed religious garb laws to keep nuns and priests from teaching in public schools. They passed all kinds. They even tried to pass a law saying that kids had to go to public school and could not go to a private or religious school. And in Pierce v. Society of Sisters, the Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional, saying parents have the right to choose between public and private. So, huge fight, this, over what this means, no establishment. Point being, it now applies to all levels of government. Right? Boy, this stuff is so much fun, this stuff. I mean, because it's just 45 words, but man, every word of it has been so discussed and litigated, and yet it's so simple at heart. Going back to what Bonnie said, our government has to recognize that these are our rights. They can't be taken away. And of course, the next discussion would be, can they be limited? That's a big discussion. And the second clause, the free exercise clause, has been, of course, the subject of much debate. Can you do anything? Does no law really mean no law? Right? And if you think about it, well, of course it can't. Justice Black, I think, was the one who wrote and said, the ink was not dry on this before they started violating it. And he had tongue in cheek, but it's kind of true, because government is going to have to limit these rights. I'll give you a stark example. The first great free exercise clause case in American history was, anybody know? The Reynolds case. The Reynolds case in like 1878, I guess, was the polygamy case. And Congress had passed laws prohibiting polygamy. And of course, that was a fundamental tenet of the LDS Church at the time. It is no more. And Congress said, you know, we're outlawing it. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said Congress has the power to do that. The Supreme Court didn't uphold polygamy. It upheld the right of Congress to ban it if it wanted to, and it did. And so that was the first great free exercise case, and you could say, well, wait a minute, no law. How can they pass a law banning polygamy if it says no law? And so the court had to address that and to say, would Justice Waite, who's the Chief Justice at the time, said, would we allow people to practice human sacrifice in the name of their faith? He chose the easy example, right? And of course, everybody goes, oh, no, we wouldn't allow that. And he says, well, point made, right? So we can draw the line here. I don't know that that's right, that polygamy is the right line to draw. I'm just saying this has been the debate throughout our history, right? Where do you draw the line? People do all sorts of things in the name of religion.
Well, the Hialeah case.
A Hialeah case, right, which involved yeah, and you know, and that's a big topic, because in spite of the fact the Supreme Court had weakened free exercise by that time, everybody signed on in support of the Santeria religion in Hialeah. I say everybody, Catholic bishops, evangelicals, Jewish community, everybody signed on in support of the Santeria folks sacrificing small animals in Hialeah. Not because they wanted the religion to do that, or not because they liked it, but because they knew that if the government, if the city of Hialeah can ban these people from practicing their faith today, then they can ban somebody else from practicing their faith tomorrow. And the Santeria folks won that case because the court said, you know, in essence, it said you can't treat them differently than you treat others. For example, in Hialeah, you can go to McDonald's. I think it's McDonald's. I don't go. I haven't been in 30 years, but I think at McDonald's you can buy these nugget things, right? Chicken, is that the right place? You can buy chicken nuggets, so you can eat the chicken at McDonald's. You could probably butcher one outside McDonald's and cook it up, but you just can't do it in a ritual sacrifice. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. So it's how it works. It's how it works. Bonnie knows her case law. I better watch myself here. All right, so that's just too much fun, but we got to move on. I just want to mention this. I don't want to dwell on it in the interest of time, but for public education, public educators in the room, and others who may be interested, I'm going to do this by shorthand and say I think we've had two failed models in public education when it comes to dealing with religious liberty in the First Amendment. And before the First Amendment applied to the public schools, having to do with basic fairness, even with state constitutions that require separation in the 19th century. Public schools generally ignored that. And you think, and so we had kind of a sacred public school model, right? Because much of the 19th century into the early 20th century, we were a semi-established Protestant nation. I know, no establishment, but that didn't mean when the Protestants generally agreed on no establishment, they didn't think they were giving up their culture. They didn't think they were giving up who we are, which they identify so closely with their values and their way of life. They thought they were kind of making this grand agreement that across all of our differences, you know, we agree that we can teach generally Christianity in the schools. We can read the King James Bible, certainly not the other one, or other ones, in the school. And that was a pretty big agreement because they, as you know, we mentioned it this morning, there were very different perspectives among Protestants. So they thought, oh, we've done it, common ground here. And so the public schools reflected that kind of agreement across great differences. But to us looking back, it looks like imposing religion. And frankly, to a lot of the people sitting in those schools who were from other faiths, it looked like imposing religion too. Not much they could do about it. The Jewish community in New York in 1843 finally had it, and they said, they complained to the school board, or if it was called that, whatever it was called, and they said, you know, we're Americans too, and we're sending our kids to these public schools, and look, here are the textbooks. They're learning the New Testament. You know, how is this possible in a public school? And the school board was kind of like, oh, what? What's the problem here? And they couldn't figure out what was the problem, so they appointed a committee. It's what you do in education. You appoint a committee. And usually it takes 30 years for reform after that. But the committee reported back and said, well, we examined all the textbooks and we couldn't find any real problem with them. Well, except for the fact they teach the gospel of Jesus Christ. But other than that, in other words, it was like a puzzle to them that people wouldn't want to learn the truth, right, in school. I mean, what else are you going to teach? I mean, that's how the mindset. And so the Jewish community, what could they do? They sat there. And if you wonder why the Jewish community has been on the forefront of a lot of this litigation in the modern period about, you know, the Christmas concert or this or that, it's because they have historically been, you know, the most affected by this. Protestant kind of, and Catholics too, but Catholics kind of started to go along later. But point is, that was the model. This exists in vestige form in some communities, but particularly in the Southeast, where I'm from originally, because it just is, they've done it forever, they still do it, and then they get caught by the ACLU and they might stop. But you know, ACLU can't be in every little town, every little school. So but you know what the irony is about this, to me, personally? The irony about all this fighting over whether we can have a 60-second prayer in the morning by the teacher, whether we can have a nativity pageant in December, they're fighting over nothing, really, in the sense that what difference would that make? To have a 60-second, to whom it may concern prayer in the morning, is going to really form the kids? No, what's going to form the kids and shape the kids is the 12 years of the curriculum, right? What you teach every day, and of course religion left the door a long time ago in the curriculum, and it came back more recently, but I mean a long time ago. Why did it leave the door? And here's the irony. A lot of the people today who most complain about God being kicked it out. And again, fear of the Catholics. So they got rid of much of the religious elements in the curriculum, the Protestant agreement. So in neighborhoods and districts where Catholics were becoming more and more numerous, papism wouldn't be put in there. Better nothing than papism. So that's not my opinion, but I'm just saying that was their opinion. So think of it, the irony of that. All these people who are fighting about whether we can say this, to whom it may concern prayer, which means nothing, and they have long abandoned the curriculum. So today, recovering the curriculum for its richness, for its depth, for understanding worldviews, for understanding how people live, what you're doing is a great thing, because when they got rid of religion, they didn't replace it with academic treatment of religion or study about the different religions or anything like that. Some, a little, but basically they didn't. So by the time I got into this business in the mid-'80s, you could read textbooks and there would be almost no mention of religion. Even in the history textbooks, you know, you have a little bit about Puritans and so forth and so on, and a lot of that was not theological. I mean, there was nothing about So we're in a better spot today, but this stuff is still being litigated in some places. The other model I call for shorthand the naked public school, which is just as it, I love somebody found this picture, and it doesn't really, it's not of a naked person, but it's like, which would be too provocative, but it's the image being, you know, in the name of separation of church and state, let's just keep it all out. Well, wait a minute. That's not what the First Amendment means, but that's what it was taken to mean, either because they wanted to avoid controversy in many schools, or because they just simply misread the Supreme Court. And you, having read Schimpf, know that that's not what the court said, but that was what was heard. And unfortunately, the fallout from those 60s prayer and Bible reading decisions led in many places, it was already coming. As I say, the curriculum was already kind of stripped of any mention of religion even before those decisions. But then, Susie can't bring her Bible to lunch kind of stuff, right? You know, Johnny can't say grace. And so forth. You get these weird cases and fights. And of course, Susie and Johnny are not the government. We went back to the First Amendment. It doesn't say Susie and Johnny cannot establish religion. Right? They're not the government. They're students. So it was deeply misunderstood. And in the name of separation, a false understanding of separation of church and state, a lot of school districts, when I started in this business, boy, you didn't even mention religion. And kids didn't mention their religion. It's like they came in the school in the morning and there was a big, you know, coat rack there and you hang your religion on it and then you come in. What kind of country is that? Right? So these were the model, I call failed models of our history. And we are working now, my center and others, for a religious freedom model or a First Amendment model in public schools. And this language that I'm going to show you is part of an agreement that we reached some years ago. My career has been partly working in local districts, working on these things, but it's also been working nationally to craft consensus statements, right? So that we can get beyond the fight. And so years ago, I got together with people on the right and the left, and I said, can we agree to some language on what the First Amendment actually looks like if you apply it in a public school? You know, what does it look like? It took us a long time to reach agreement on this language, but part of the agreement was this: the public schools may not inculcate nor inhibit religion. They must be places where religion and religious conviction are treated with fairness and respect. Now you might say, I could have done that in an hour. Why did it take you, you know, a year? But you know, everything has to be thought over and decided in a democracy like this. So the National Association of Evangelicals had to agree to this, but so did People for the American Way. The teachers' unions had to agree, the school boards had to agree, and so on, right? So we got a whole long list of people that agreed to this. Very important, though, because if you just show them the First Amendment, you can say whatever you want, right? Everybody can see their own answer in the First Amendment. This begins to tease out. May not inculcate nor inhibit. First word, you could say so many: promote, endorse, rejected, right? I mean, this was amazing. Inhibit, you could say denigrate. There's a lot of words, but these words were picked because they were the most acceptable to everybody. And the First Amendment actually does mean this. It doesn't just mean you can't impose religion on kids in a public school. It also means you can't be negative and hurt religion or and denigrate or tear it down. I mean, a teacher who gets up in a science class, and some kid says, in my church we believe, you know, in creation, and we don't accept evolutionary theory. Well, the student has the right to say that in the class as part of the discussion, right to, and the science teacher can say, but I'm going to teach you what most scientists believe. That's That's the job. But if the teacher says, you know what, this happens, that's just nonsense. That's just silly. That's a fairy tale. How can you believe it? You know, that kind of thing. And sadly, there are teachers who do that. That is just as unconstitutional as a teacher getting up and said, you know, Darwin was nonsense, and, you know, the earth was created 6,000 years. That's also unconstitutional for a science teacher. So it works both ways. It's supposed to work both ways. Usually the people who denigrate religion get more away with it than the people who promote it. I'm just saying. I don't think that's fair, but that's the way it is. Public schools uphold the First Amendment when they protect the religious liberty rights of students of all faiths or none. Remember, the First Amendment's for everybody. There's like, what, a fourth of the American people now or more that say they're not affiliated with any religion. Now, they're not all atheists or agnostics or free thinkers. I mean, they may be believers of one kind or another, but they're not affiliated. This was a big deal for conservative groups, particularly Christian groups, because, you know, they felt when this was being drafted, and they still, many of them feel today, that's why we have so much tension and litigation, the public schools are inherently hostile to their faith. And schools demonstrate fairness when they ensure that the curriculum includes study about religion, where appropriate, as an important part of a complete education. You notice the about is italicized. And you're saying, well, so what?
Quite like a month over that italicization.
Well, I tell you what, this is the true story behind the scenes. We were about ready to go to press on this thing. I'd gotten everybody to agree, and the trick is you get them to agree separately. Well, if you have big meetings all the time, you never get agreement. So you have a few big meetings, but basically you call up one and say, well, so-and-so is on board. How about you? You know, it's like that. So, and then when you hang up from them, you call the other guys and say, so-and-so's on board. How about you? And eventually you get everybody. But you trick them into it is what you do. But we were about ready to go to press, or print this up, send it out, have a press conference. And Elliot Mintzberg, he's still around, People for the American Way, which was founded to fight the religious right, so-called, called me up and said, Charles, we're not happy. And I said, shoot me now. No, I said, what's wrong, Elliot? We've agreed to all this wording, and we're ready to go. We have all of our, and without them, I wouldn't have the credibility. So I said, you know, because they were one of our most strongest left civil liberties groups. He said, well, it's going to be misunderstood, so you have to italicize the word about. And I said, oh, okay, Elliot, we'll give you that concession. And I said, and I italicized it. I didn't ask anybody. I just italicized it. And the other groups didn't even notice, I don't think. But he was thrilled. He thought he'd won this big concession. But anyway, I tell you, after a while, you're in the culture wars so much that it all seems like it doesn't make any sense. But anyway, we got it.
Can
Yeah.
I put a word in favor of that italicization?
Oh, no, you're right. It's good. I'm all for it now. No, you're right. It's good. It does emphasize.
What I really value about that italicization is that it highlights the difference between the academic study of religion as a subject area in a broader liberal education versus Sunday school
Right.
or whatever other denominational devotional tradition. And so many Americans, I think everyone in this room accepted, but so many Americans don't even get the idea that there is such a thing as a secular study of religion.
Right.
And that little italicization helps to bring that home. So I'm glad.
Well, thank you, Elliot Mintzberg. I'm so glad you're still around. My voice on this side of my no, I actually thought it was good. It's good to emphasize it. All right. Any question about this agreement? Yes.
Something I want to try to continuing on. You mentioned earlier that your school would be eligible for Title I money, but your district has decided to reject it. So one of the things that I was just thinking about the first bullet
Well, let me pick up on that because I think what that example is actually very useful for quickly illustrating how the Establishment Clause works today. So, about the prayer space. First of all, that list, I guess, is from the federal government.
Correct.
Right. And probably the current Department of Education has not reviewed it in a while, or it wouldn't be on there. The wording ought to be that the school agrees that it would try to accommodate the religious requests of students for prayer space. It's very problematic, though, to single it out as prayer space. Anyway, whatever it is, they did it, that's fine. But the Establishment Clause problem would arise if and only if the school decided, well, you know, we got a lot of these students who want to use this space. And of course, they'd have to allow any students. They couldn't allow just the Muslim students who need it. Even though that may be more of an obligation for Muslim students, it doesn't matter. First Amendment purposes, they have to be, well, we're going to create a chapel type thing, right? I mean, you know, because sometimes the room isn't free and so forth. So we're going to dedicate this room over here, and we're going to put in some stuff, and then people can put in their own. See, then you have an Establishment Clause violation. As long as it's a voluntary space, it's a free space, and the school doesn't designate it, they should not designate it permanently as a prayer space. If they do, that's a problem. But it's just like, well, if students need, we can provide this space. So under the Establishment Clause, the government can accommodate religion. If it couldn't, there'd be no free exercise at some point, right? There has to be some ability of government to accommodate religious needs of the students, requirements. But when it inches toward paying for something, building something, or in some other way endorsing, promoting, or getting entangled with the religious activity, then it's a violation. No bright line. There's kind of a spectrum here, but so there is what I think Lawrence Tribe used to call a zone of permissible accommodation under the Establishment Clause of religion. So you can accommodate students as long as you don't say, all right, we're taking attendance at who goes to prayer meetings, or we're going to put up religious symbols in this room permanently. Things like that you cannot do. So does that make sense? So that's kind of how, it's a good example for how the Establishment Clause is supposed to work. It doesn't always work. Speaking of which, and we won't go through all of these, aren't you glad?
Can I also just point out, I'm sorry, but I meant to mention earlier, Charles has generously already agreed that I'm going to share this with you all later. So you don't need to start jotting down details of every single court case.
Yeah. And then
You'll get a copy of this later.
yeah, then you too can show this in your district. No, I'm not going, I would like to, but it would take too long, and you would be probably bored, to go through all the different tests that the Supreme Court has crafted. These are most of them, for deciding when does the government establish religion and when does it not. So like the example I just gave, it's not a bright line, so you have to have a test. A test. You know, does this cross the line? Does that cross the line? It's not easy because all it says is Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion. That's all it says. So you got to say, well, when does that occur? And over the years, and you notice going back to 48, because before then there was no Establishment Clause issue in a public school. So it's only with incorporation through the 14th Amendment in 48 do you get this. So, you know, you get teachers in public schools in the hall teaching the priest, the rabbi, and the minister. Sounds like the beginning of a joke, but they're teaching their different classes in a hall in a public school. And Mrs. McCullum said, no, you can't do that. That violates the First Amendment. Nobody thought of that before. Really? I mean, they said, well, why would that violate the First Amendment? Well, you can't have the school setting up religious classes during the school day. So the school said, yes, we can, litigated, and Mrs. McCullum won. And the school said, and so that was a very strict separation decision. You cannot have religious classes, going back to Henry's point, you can't be teaching religion. You can teach about religion, but you can't be teaching religion under the auspices of a public school. People were outraged. You can imagine. Oh my gosh, like the prayer decisions. People just got outraged. You're kicking out religion and kicking God out and everything. So, a few years later, you get the court giving back some of the territory it took away in Zorach. And that's when they upheld released time. And some school districts, you don't have to have released time in your school district, but a district can choose to have released time or not, which means that the same students who were there in that little class with the priest or the minister or the rabbi could be released for an hour or whatever on Wednesday afternoon, whenever they do it, to go nearby to religious teaching. There's one religious group in the United States that has taken great advantage of release time. Others used to, and now it's spotty. It's kind of gone away because it takes too much time, it's complicated. There's one religious group that loves public education, partly because they've taken advantage of this option that the Supreme Court allows the school districts to do. Can you imagine who it would be? Yes. Who said that? Latter-day Saints, who we do not call Mormons anymore. Well, we don't. They say they don't want to be called Mormons anymore. The prophet said no more Mormons. I asked my friend who attends the Committee on Religious Liberty meetings from the Mormon Church. I said, well, what are we supposed to call? I said, you got to come up with something shorter than the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Because the prophet also didn't want it to be Latter-day Saints. He said, it's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So they haven't yet settled on a shorter version, so I find myself stumbling. But the LDS Church in Utah, I don't think there is a high school in Utah that doesn't have a seminary next door. I don't think so. There may be, and then in Idaho and other places where there are a lot of LDS believers. So they've taken real advantage of it. All right, we won't get into all this. Lemon, the justices don't like anymore. And this decision on the Bladenboro Cross, Peace Cross, that just came down by the Supreme Court, a lot of the justices took it as an opportunity to take another hit at Lemon, why they don't like it. Lower courts still kind of use it, primarily because the U.S. Supreme Court hasn't replaced the Lemon test with another test that everyone can agree on. So you still see it. I won't get into the Lemon test because it's not really relevant right now, but a lot of the school aid cases for you Catholic school folks were decided with using this test. You know, is the purpose of the government's aid, what is the purpose? Does it have an educational purpose? Well, yeah, you're helping school get computers, okay. Does it, is the primary effect of it to promote religion or denigrate religion or inhibit religion? Well, the primary effect is to help kids on the computer, and so you argue this, you see. It's not to promote the Catholic faith. Well, don't they use the computer to learn about the Catholic faith? Then the other side says. So it's like that. So the Lemon test was used to sort of, and then does it entangle the government with, that's the third part of the test, with the religion? And that's tough, you know. What does that mean? Most justices don't like it anymore, want to get rid of it, but they don't know what to do because they can't agree on a replacement. Endorsement? Yeah.
Is that why, like, when colleges start occupational therapy, physical therapy, that ends up doing a class outside school, and not in Catholic schools, is that the reason?
Right. That's right. So some things can go in, like, you know, maps and so forth, you can go, that can go as aid right into the classroom. Other things have to be done off the site. The line of cases is very difficult, and you know, a lot of line drawing, and some people say it makes no sense. The effort is, how can we keep government from entangling itself with religion, from funding religion? So the big issue always under the Establishment Clause is money, not surprisingly. Funding religion, because That is a violation of conscience for many, many people who have crafted this over the years, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The first great battle in Virginia over this was Henry wanted to pass a bill where everybody got some money for their ministers, all the different groups. And people said, oh, what a liberal policy, because it's not just the Anglicans anymore. Everybody gets some. And even Quaker schools that don't have a religion, a clergy, they get something too. Everybody thought, oh, a lot of people thought, oh, this is a great compromise. Madison said, money should not flow from government to religion, because that is the step of, first of all, the key to oppression. If government can fund, then it can control. And secondly, it destroys the authenticity of the religions. And the Baptists argued this. If you have government money coming in, then you start to behave in a way that brings the money. So, or as David Saperstein in Washington likes to say, with shekels come shackles. Right? So, follow the money has been the big question in the Establishment Clause jurisprudence. How do you keep government from getting entangled with religion through use of funding, government funding? Because there's where the control comes. And that's why these parochial school aid cases are so torturous to read, because they're trying to say, oh, we're not supporting religion, we're supporting, maps for kids, and, like that. So, Catherine?
What if the reverse, where the school is giving money to a religious group that allows a religious group of students to freely meet without paying that in the building? Does that, because that allow that group to not pay for something themselves, does that count as the school? So, if a Christian religious group wants to meet in the school after school, we've got this happen, right? And they give them classroom space to do that. That's essentially donating space, which could include,
That falls into that zone that I mentioned for the justices, for the majority. It doesn't for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. So it depends on your point of view. But under the law right now, that falls into that permissible accommodation, because then the justice will say, look, just treat everybody the same. And yes, it's de minimis. The legal term is de minimis support. You're giving them the room. You're not giving them funding exactly. You're just doing what you do for everybody else. You let them use the room. Others will argue, no, 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 no. Religion is different. So that's the battle. But those separationist arguments have lost at the Supreme Court when it comes to use of school facilities. Yes?
how does like school choice fit into the states that are experimenting?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the voucher question is exactly a progeny of all this litigation about aid, right? So the Supreme Court finally upheld vouchers as constitutional under the First Amendment. And boy, a lot of civil libertarians, separationists, think that was a terrible decision. But they did not uphold vouchers that would aid religious schools. They upheld vouchers that would go to parents who then could choose to take it to a religious school. And you might say, well, wait a minute. Isn't that like, instead of eating like this, eating like this? It's the same thing. And yes, it is. But the pro-voucher folks won the argument that properly set up, that voucher program does not violate the Establishment Clause, because it is a parent that is getting the money to take his or her voucher. Now, what happens if there are only religious schools to choose from? Well, there hasn't been a case like that. There have been in Cleveland, which was the case involving the Supreme Court's decision. There were a lot of religious schools, but there were some others. And the court said, see, they have choices, religious, secular, whatever, and it's not government money going to religion. And the other side screamed and said, right. So the Supreme Court has allowed more indirect aid to religion under more conservative justices in recent times. So you see the court moving from very strict separation early on, the late 40s, 50s, to today, more accommodation, more, well, this isn't, going to violate because It helps the parents and the children. It doesn't take your pick. Now, the other wrinkle in your question is why then don't states have voucher programs if it's constitutional? Because it isn't necessarily constitutional under state constitutions. Going back to those state constitutions with those very strict separation clauses, some of them are called Blaine amendments, James Blaine. Point being, those strict state constitutional provisions have stopped vouchers in places like Florida. So the Florida legislature wants to change the Constitution, the Republicans, because they want vouchers, but they can't because the courts, they haven't succeeded in some of these states. So in other words, the battle is now a state by state for vouchers. Some states, either for support of public school reasons or for state constitutional reasons, don't allow vouchers. Other states do. Yeah, yeah.
So, and I apologize, this question may be revelatory kind of ignorance. I spent the first decade of my career in Philadelphia public schools, and now I teach at a Catholic school in Florida. And we receive Title II funding. And anytime I go to the administration and ask for different professional development needs, I basically kind of get this runaround about, well, we can't use it for this, we can't use it for that. And then when I press further because I don't understand how this works, and I'm hoping maybe you can explain it a little bit to me, I can't get a straight answer from the administration about exactly what is Title II and how they're applying it specifically in our diocese within the state of Florida. And I know that's very specific.
Well, I think the short answer is that the regulations that they have are meant to conform to the constitutional limitations placed by the court on aid to parochial schools.
State or federal constitution?
Federal. So this money is federal. So the federal government can now give some monies to parochial schools, private schools, or religious schools, but there's a lot of conditions. If there's any suggestion that any of it is going for religious purposes, they cannot do it. So therefore, in the local level, the diocese has to have very clear regulations about where the money is going, what it's being used for.
So if they're funding, if they're giving me, I don't know, something, a plane ticket to go to an IB conference, for instance. But every day I'm still coming into the school and asking me, you're required to leave a prayer at the beginning of every class. Needing that education as an educator is still, in my mind, technically applying it toward a religious cause.
Right, and that's the argument the separationists would argue. They're saying money is fungible, and just because the school says we're just using it for this, we're not using it over here, doesn't mean that it isn't helping the school fulfill its religious mission. But they've lost that argument. That's all. They've lost. So, if Americans United were standing in front of you today, they'd say, you're right. Money goes here, but it helps over here, here. The school's mission is religious, and government money, tax dollars, should not go. So Madison said to spend even 1 penny of someone's money, tax money, on religion is a violation of conscience. He said 1 penny. And he was adamant about that. But the other side argues, well, they're not spending it on religion. Right? They're spending it on this right here. Yeah, but you know what? All this indirect aid now going to religious institutions, it's pretty much getting to the point where it's hard to know where there is a line anymore. Yeah, because these were tests that Justice O'Connor championed, Justice Kennedy championed. They're both gone. They were the 5th vote for a long time on these cases. And since they were 5th votes, they got to say what test they were going to use. They're gone. And this is another test. The one that you've looked at in Shemp is the one we should spend a little time thinking about. Here's a quote from that Shemp decision, which I'm sure you've memorized by now. Justice Tom Clark wrote it for the court. And this has become the quote most often quoted part of the decision. because it has been used over and over again by advocates for more study about religion or religious studies in public education to say, you see, the court did not say we couldn't teach about religion. It simply said you can't, promote, endorse, inculcate religion. So that's why this quote, you see this over and over again. I use it over in my consensus guidelines because of that as well. And he tries to give a little bit of a rationale, not as a religious studies guy, but as best he can as a justice. So anybody want to say anything more about the Schimpf thing that as you were reading? There's some things about the Schimpf decision that you might want to talk about a little bit. So let's pause and have you say what you want about the Schimpf decision. What struck you, if anything, else about how they decided this case about Bible reading, prayer? Do you think they got it right?
There's a lot of reasons that school districts don't move forward with this idea. I know Texas had an initiative there for a while to incorporate religious, like comparative religions, sort of a coursework into the curriculum, and never really moved forward with it. And I think that a lot of that is just fear. Fear of what will be the legal consequences if we cross the line somehow. And so I'm not really sure that this is ever going to fully manifest because of fear.
Right.
That the school districts have about litigation.
Right, and yeah, go ahead, Danny. Well, that's his language. It does suggest that, doesn't it? It is. Right. I mean, he does say comparative religion, which is not a phrase we use much anymore. But he does lift up the Bible because they're striking down Bible reading. So that's probably why he wanted to lift that up and say, well, we're getting rid of that, but we don't mean you can't teach about the Bible, right? Study of the Bible or of religion. So I think the reason for that emphasis is because of the shock waves that he knew would come in the country when he said you can no longer in the morning have a Bible reading. Sent shock waves. The interesting thing, what he's suggesting is a huge improvement on reading the Bible without comment, which was the agreement in schools. So the agreement was, okay, well, we'll just do a Bible reading. And of course, Protestants like that because that's how the Protestants think about it. You hear the word, you receive the word. Roman Catholics and said, well, wait a minute, that's not how we treat the Bible. Didn't matter. The Protestants prevailed because it was their schools in essence, and they said, look, that's what we're going to do is read the Bible. So he knew, Justice Clark knew, that by saying you can no longer have the Bible read, that the outrage would be great that the Bible was being exiled from public schools. So that's why I think he sort of says, no. We're not saying the Bible is out. It can be in study of the Bible. And if you think about it, the replacement is much richer and deeper, including the Bible's study about it. But for many conservative Christians, that's a fearful thing because they don't trust that the academic study of the Bible will be good for them. He was just because that's the case was Bible reading, right? He uses a secular program, of education. So he wants to say religion is not out. Religion is in, but here's how it's in. Right? Now,
this is on the bottom of page 9 in the printout of the Schimpf decision that we all have. This super famous quote at the bottom of page 9. And that whole kind of last section of Justice Clark's decision is kind of crux of it, and starting in the middle of page 8.
I mean, the justices were trying so hard not to be misunderstood, and they weren't. Because no one read this. I'm not talking about you, I'm sure you have or will. But no one read the decision. All they heard was God is being kicked out of the public schools. That's what they heard. Our schools are now godless. And that's a danger for our country, it's a danger for our morality, it's a danger for our future. I mean, people were, as you probably know from reading about this, it was the most hated, that and the Vitale decision a year earlier, the most hated Supreme Court decisions in American history until Roe came along. But, I mean, just complete outrage. So he was trying to be heard, and it didn't get any traction, except among some academics and educators who said, oh, okay, we finally have a way to get in. And that's when the movement started, Bonnie, you know, in some states to try to include it. And in some states did. Florida adopted a statewide program of world religions. So did Pennsylvania, religious literature of the West, and they were going to do one religious literature of the East, and then it died away. And it was widely taught across Pennsylvania for a while. In other words, there was kind of like an explosion of interest in the 70s. And this Harvard Ed School put out a thing about how you teach about religion in schools and so forth and so on. It was while I was there, actually. And so it was an explosion. And then it sort of died down because it didn't have a constituency. Well, think about it. People over here on the right said, that's not what we want. I mean, I'm being glib here, but in a way they were saying, it's better than nothing, but gee, we're not interested in the academic study of religion. We want God. We want religion. We want kids to be moral, you know? This is just stuff, and probably even get kids not to like it anymore, or misunderstand it, or leave their religion. You know, literary criticism and historical criticism, you know, we're doomed, you know? Over here on the left, a lot of folks said, no. We got it out, we won, it's finished, no more prayers, no more Bible reading. You're not going to sneak it back in with this teaching about religion stuff. We know what you're doing. And in some school districts, what you're going to do is set up a Bible course, an academic Bible course, and then you're going to go ahead and teach your version. We know you're going to do that, and of course they were right, they did do that in some places. So you can see how the constituency for this wasn't there, except among some of us who were kind of like, well, this is great, we should do this. This will help kids and people learn about one another, all the good arguments that you know now. This is good for education. It's, as you know, Warren and I make this argument. Man, it fell on deaf ears for a long time. So when the mid-'80s came along and we finally started again to push this, and now religion is in the curriculum. I think we've gotten over the fear. All state standards, social studies, have considerable mention of religion today. Not true 20, 25, 30 years ago. All textbooks used widely in public schools today have a lot more of study about religion, from zero to, it's not great in some cases, but there it is. So we've come from here to here in what public school time is a short time, in reform time. And that's because in the mid-'80s we found consensus on how to do this, and we started a new push for teaching about religion that we could build a constituency for. And fortunately, for reasons I won't get into, that constituency started to build. Like the consensus statement I showed you a minute ago. We finally got some consensus. This is a good thing, we should do this, but it took a long time. So yes, in the wake of Schempp, there was a spurt that died because of no support, or little support. But you know what a lasting legacy of this is, besides public education? What really happened after this decision that has lasted? A lot of public universities and colleges started religion departments. You can trace the start of religious studies in a lot of these places to the fallout from this. Interesting, right? That hasn't gone away. So you can say that Clark was heard by some, and it did have an impact, but it took years later in the 80s for it to kind of get a restart in public schools. And I will say this, private schools. Private schools also, I think, have been affected by this conversation of the dangers of religious illiteracy in a culture that's as diverse as ours, the need for people to learn about one another, and all the conversations that kind of flowed from this, I think, did also affect private, independent religious school culture. My first teaching internship when I was at Harvard Divinity School was a Roman Catholic school in Dorchester. And they were trying hard to have religious studies classes in that Roman Catholic school because they believed that this was important for the kids, that they were going to live in a culture that had all these different religions and so forth. So I think that, not all because of this, but I think that this national conversation about the need for religious literacy affected not just public education, but affected private education as well. Yes, yes.
In the sort of background of the case when they were describing the trial, they mentioned that I think the father testified at the second trial that he was saying, well, I could have excused my children from these exercises, but I decided against it in part because the relationships with their teachers and classmates would be adversely affected. And it's, which like totally made sense to me, that sort of just like having kids removed for this one period of time and then sending them back would be difficult. How, I guess, but wondering the extent to which the court could take into account sort of nuance and complexity about like relationships and how they'd be affected about like sending students to this special space to pray, for example, could also be seen as like, oh, this person just disappeared again, right? Like that's also going to affect their relationship with teachers and students.
That's right.
And like, how do you take into account?
That's a great question, and I think the difference would be between those accommodations for religion that people choose to take on themselves and those that are imposed by the school. So those that take on themselves, we can't inoculate people against being different or feeling different, or if their parents say, you can't eat that hot dog. Everybody else gets the hot dog, you can't have the hot dog. Well, and the kid says, I want the hot dog. Well, first of all, the teachers can't be the ones to monitor that. That has to be. But what I'm saying is that students are going to be different. They're going to wear head coverings. They're going to do different things by their choice or their parents' choice. That's different than the school saying, okay, Luke, we're going to pray now, so you go stand in the hallway. That's stigmatizing a kid, marginalizing a kid, and the justices didn't like that idea, rightly so. But that's different from the school saying, look, Jehovah's Witnesses have come to us and say we don't let our kids participate in birthday parties. Can you imagine the kids' birthday parties? You know, it's like in a lot of schools they have this stuff all the time, and these poor kids have to get up and leave, go to the library. Well, that's their choice, or if it's not the kid's choice, it's the parent's choice. And that's a matter of conscience. And schools have to try to accommodate that when they can. They can't always. They can't say, you know, Johnny can leave every time we mention a religion in world history that isn't Johnny's because the parents are offended. No, because then you couldn't teach world history. You'd be jumping up and down all the time. So there are limits on accommodation. But accommodation is not imposition, is what I'm saying. Yes, Steve.
Someone asked a little while ago about a group of students wanting to meet after school during a lunch day and have a Bible study. And that's permissible. I moderate a club. You might moderate a club. I moderate the Black Student Union at my school. And as a moderator, I contribute to the discussion. And kids ask me questions, and I'll give input when I think input is needed. I cannot do that, though, when moderating a Christian club or Islamic club. Why?
The Congress passed in 1984 the Equal Access Act, and the Supreme Court upheld it several years later in the Mergens decision. The Equal Access Act, which probably is the most significant piece of legislation for, at the time, conservative religious groups, but I think generally for accommodating religion in public school in modern history. And it said, in essence, if a school has extracurricular clubs, it doesn't have to. You can just have school-related clubs. That's another thing. You can, we have a history club, we have a French club, we have the government, we have the newspaper. It's all school-related, connected to the curriculum-related, I should say. But if you have one that's not curriculum-related and you can't be cute about it, say, well, the chess club is math-related, so we have this. No. If you have a chess club, a scuba diving club, a Pokemon club, I don't know what you have. If you have all those things, you cannot say no in secondary schools to students who want to form a religious club or a political club. So it opened the door. But there were rules in the act. And the rules are because of the Establishment Clause. In the case of religious clubs, it has to be student-led, student-initiated. Now, they can have a guest speaker come in, like the local minister, occasionally, like if other clubs have guest speakers. The school can say no guest speakers for anybody, but guest speakers, okay. But that outside person can't regularly attend or lead, and the monitor, whoever the faculty person is who's the monitor, sponsor, if you will, can't participate. And that was put in there to make sure that these student religious clubs were student religious clubs, and that the school had no influence on them, they have to monitor them for insurance purposes, obviously, but no involvement. So that's how we came to have the guidelines that you're talking about.
Can I clarify?
Yeah.
So the adult monitor not participating is only in the instance of a religious club?
Political too.
Or political?
You said religious, political part of that, just religious.
Just religious.
Yeah, they kind of carved it out for, so they didn't say, some of the Act's language is a little bit vague. We did guidelines, consensus guidelines on how to interpret the Act in the early 90s, and I got all these different groups to agree, and we gave fuller answers because we were trying to tease out what the legislation means. But in our view, student religious clubs are treated differently under the Act because of the Establishment Clause problem. So, yeah, it's different, which is a good thing, because again, it keeps the government out of the religion business. That's what it does, and that's the whole point, right? We don't want public schools, teachers or administrators, getting entangled with people's religion during the school day. We're not going to do that. So that's why it's different. Now, young lady Mergens, I think her name was Bridget, let's say, Mergens, I can't remember her first name, in Washington State, she wanted to form a Christian club. And guess what? They had all these other clubs. They said, oh no, they're all curriculum related. They just declared them curriculum related. They waved their hand over them. And we're not going to allow you. Well, this young lady took it all the way to the Supreme Court and won. And Justice O'Connor wrote the decision, and she said, in essence, to the school, we know what you're doing. You're setting it up so you don't have to have a student religious club. You can't do that. So it's a big change. There are hundreds and hundreds of these clubs now in public education. There are some Jewish clubs, there are some Muslim clubs, but as expected, the vast majority are Bible clubs or Christian clubs. Huge change. 1984, it's and one of the reasons why my work since then, that's kind of when I got involved, has been easier in some ways to build consensus on religion in schools, is because some of the pressure was taken off by the Equal Access Act. It was a huge sigh of relief and gratitude among conservative Christian groups that finally their students could get together and have their own religious club and experience. They can worship, they can pray, they can read their Bible in the school setting. So it took the pressure off. So we got agreement on other things. You know what the irony of that is, the footnote irony, Steve? They liked it until the Gay-Straight Alliance came on. Yeah. I know. They said, oh, this is great, this is great. Now we're going to, and then people came along and said, we're going to form a gay straight alliance. Oh, this is terrible. This is terrible. And in some school districts, they tried to say, we can't allow that because they're discussing sex.
But that actually is curriculum related.
Not in Texas, it ain't. So people like it when their agenda is protected by the law. They are less happy when it's something they don't like. And but like it or not, it opened the door for students to form all kinds of clubs. And there are limits. They can't form a club of its hate group or something like that. But generally speaking, it's pretty open. Now the school can shut it down too. They can say no extracurricular clubs. And some schools do that. Some schools just don't want to allow any because they don't want to deal with it. I think that's very sad. Okay, a last word about the Shemp thing from my perspective is that in the concurring opinion of Justice Goldberg, I always like to kind of underscore his discussion of neutrality. Because I think one of the, I don't have a slide for it, but it's, and I don't know what page it's on either, but it's a concurring opinion, it's a short thing towards, after you get the majority, then you get, I think Brennan writes a treatise. Goldberg.
Page 48.
Arthur Goldberg.
And Harlan. I would also recommend Brennan's treatise, though.
Oh, it's very interesting.
It's
yeah.
like a fascinating history.
Yeah,
lesson.
it's longer than the majority opinion. Brennan was a hoot. So Justice Goldberg says, and it's just a little bit into his opinion, and this is fascinating to me because I think this helps correct some misunderstanding about neutrality. It is said, and I agree, that the attitude of government toward religion must be one of neutrality, which I think is the guiding principle in public schools under the Establishment Clause. But untutored devotion to the concept of neutrality can lead to invocation or approval of results which partake not simply of that non-interference and non-involvement with the religious, which the Constitution commands, I love his language here, but of a brooding and pervasive devotion to the secular and a passive or even active hostility to the religious. Such results are not only compelled by the not compelled by the Constitution, but it seems to me are prohibited by it. In other words, you can become France if you're not careful. Separation of church and state in France means government just keeps a religion out and tells it what to do and when it can come in. And he's saying the French may say that we're going to preserve our secular state by doing this. Goldberg is saying that's not our arrangement. We don't do that. Religion is protected to be in this country. In other words, the First Amendment separates church from state, but not religion from public life or public schools. But how it comes in is the question. And then he says, neither the government nor this court can or should ignore the significance of the fact that a vast portion of our people believe and worship God, many of our legal and personal values derived from religious teachings. And here's the interesting sentence for me. Government must inevitably take cognizance of the existence of religion, and indeed, under certain circumstances, the First Amendment may require that it do so. And it seems to me, from the opinions in the present past case, that the court would recognize the propriety of providing military chaplains and the teaching about religion as distinguished from the teaching of religion in the public schools. So you see, what Goldberg is saying here is there may be times when government not only can accommodate religion, but must. Now, whether you agree with his examples or not, the military chaplaincy is still being argued by people, but the argument is if you take people out of their communities and into the services, particularly if they have to go overseas, and you take them away from their religious communities and their practice of their faith, you have to provide something to help them. Whether you agree with that or not, that's how the chaplaincy was born. That argument. So it seems like it's a violation of the Establishment Clause if you just look at it. But the court said, no, it's not. It's an accommodation that we have to do because we're the ones that took them out of their communities. And teaching about religion, he's the only justice I know of that's kind of gone where Warren Nord and I kind of pushed, and that is, if you leave religion out of a history discussion completely, is that neutral? I'm just saying, Luke. If I ignore you, I'm not going to, but if I were to ignore you and you wanted to say something, would you think Haynes is being neutral? No, you would think hostile, or what's wrong with it? So that's what Goldberg is saying. That's not neutral to ignore religion. So in a way, he's saying it may rise to the level of you actually have to take cognizance of religion in those circumstances, because otherwise it's not neutrality. Now, you don't have to agree with him, but that's what he's saying. Make sense? You don't have to agree with him, but I like it. I wish Goldberg had been on the court longer. I like that you can summarize the test in a public school setting for establishment or no establishment with one word, and that's fairness. Not a bad word, one we all learned in kindergarten, right? Neutrality as fairness. Public school teacher, administrator, fair, neutral, honest broker. For everybody. The coach, and they are the folks I have the hardest time with, honestly, getting this. They go, oh, because they want to pray with their kids. Okay, fine. They want to do that. They cannot do it, but I explain to them that they are not just because of the government position they're in or the First Amendment. They are, when they arrive at the school as coach, they are putting on their First Amendment hat. Or you could call it their We the People hat, whatever you like. They are there for everybody. Right? Oh, don't they have free exercise rights? Well, yes, when they take the hat off, when the school day ends, they have all the free exercise rights anybody does. But when they take on that role representing all of us in a public school and the conscience, protecting the conscience of every parent and every student, they are wearing that hat, coach. And if you pray with the students, there'll be some students who'll do it because they don't want to be kicked off or not allowed to play as much or whatever. Of course they're going to be coerced into it. If you, and if you just say, well, you don't have to do it, and these are kids. And I said, your job is to be there for all the kids. Some may be atheists. Some may be of a minority faith that doesn't want to get into your Lord's Prayer circle. They have a hard time with this. But their role is to say to the students, you know what? Some of the students say, well, we want to pray, coach. I said, well, you're free to pray before the game if you want to, and you're free not to. And I'm just going to be over here. You do what you want. If you want, some of you want to pray, that's fine. If they really do it right, they're telling the kids, they're signaling to the kids, this is what freedom of conscience looks like. This is what the First Amendment looks like. This is what your coach is modeling for you. I wish we had more coaches who would do that. And then the students, some of them would pray and some of them would not, and so forth. Now, you can't account for peer pressure always, so yeah, I understand that doesn't cure every problem, but at least it's a big step away from the idea that somehow or another the coach, because he says my faith is more important than my public school job. Okay, fine. That's what they tell me. My duty to Christ is number one. And I say, well, fine. Then maybe you're not in the right job. No, really. If you are so committed to that, I respect that, but this may not be the school for you. And then if I had time, I would say, well, be a Roger Williams. No, because his faith was number one in his life. No question about it. He was the most committed Christian you'll ever encounter in our history. And he would say, if you are a Christian, you can't play with those kids as a school official. Roger Williams would say, if you want to be a truly Christian nation, you can't be a Christian nation. That's a truly Christian nation cannot be a Christian nation. because then it's not Christianity. So he says, so that's what I try to get to the coaches with mixed success. Sometimes it takes the ACLU or somebody coming in to tell them that. But. All right, we want to get to case studies because every year that Henry's been kind enough to ask me, I never get there in time to really give it time. But I want to just say a word about free exercise because we haven't. And we don't have to say a lot because the case studies will bring some of this out. But there is another clause, and it's very important. There he is. I know it's not Yoda. It's, I know, disappointing. It's Justice Brennan, speaking of which. And he gave us this compelling interest test, or he wrote the majority opinion. I don't think we need to get into this because it's too much, because it's the Supreme Court has has said you don't have, maybe not have to use this anymore in a lot of cases. Many of your states, though, those of you in public education, have passed laws requiring government to use this test because the Supreme Court weakened it, so states have restored it through Religious Freedom Restoration Acts in different states. Those acts are now under great dispute because of the LGBTQ fight, and so what used to be kind of uncontroversial, 20-some states passed these things, and then some people decided, well, maybe we can use this to let wedding vendors turn away same-sex couples. I think they were wrong. I don't think the Religious Freedom Restoration Acts would work that way. They don't should not trump civil rights laws. But I'm just saying, that's when the explosion happened, and now if you say Religious Freedom Restoration Act, everybody jumps up and down and gets all excited because they think that it's going to be used for discrimination. But the test is still a good test. In some states, it's required, either under your state constitution or under your state Religious Freedom Restoration Act. New York has one, Pennsylvania has one, Texas has one, California has one. I mean, there are a lot of these. And the simple thing is that if you ask these questions, and this is especially good for public school people, if you ask these questions, you have a pretty good idea of whether you're upholding the Religious Freedom Free Exercise Clause or not. Whether you're required to or not is a debate. You just ask these questions. The first two questions, don't worry too much about. Stipulate them mostly. I mean, so a parent comes, you know, my family, we can't have our kids read this particular story in this collection of stories because it offends our faith. Can you give us an alternative reading? Is that a sincere religious belief? Well, I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about that. If that parent is in your office or in your classroom, it's probably sincere. It wouldn't be there. Probably sincerely mad, too, you know. But they're there, so wouldn't worry about it. I mean, if it's some outrageous thing like my kids can't do math because we're math atheists, then you should probably question sincerity. But otherwise, don't worry about that. And then the other question for the parent would be, is this a substantial burden? Now, that's a weasel word in the law, because what is substantial? Well, I wouldn't worry about that either. Listen, if they feel so deeply that they want to opt out of this particular reading, they probably think it's a substantial burden to make the kid read it and study it. That's pretty big for them. So I think you could get past those two. Then the question goes to the teacher or to the administrator or to the state or the government or whatever. What is your interest in having them read that story? Well, do you have any interests in public schools that you think are important? What are your interests? Reading's a state interest, isn't it? Kids need to know how to read, right? Need to know how to do math for the society. So you have a lot of compelling interests. You may not have thought of these as compelling. They are Believe me, they are compelling interests. The society has founded public education because it believes that people need to be educated, and you can make the case that we have a compelling state interest in teaching Johnny to read. But here's the hard question, and it should be last one here, but it isn't. What did I do? There it is. Okay, good. I didn't bop it off. Here's the hardest question for the government, or for the teacher, or for the administrator. Yes, we have a compelling interest to teach Johnny to read. Well, is there any less restrictive way of accomplishing that interest except by making him read every story in this book? That's a little hard. Well, Your Honor, I mean, you know, I don't know. I guess he could get an alternative. Yeah, we'll give him an alternative for that story. See? You've protected conscience. You're teaching him to read, and you're you're disrupting your own thing a little bit by giving him an alternative reading. Freedom of conscience is probably worth it, I would say. Now, you have a compelling interest, and what if they want to opt out is like I mentioned earlier, every time another religion is mentioned but theirs, and it's a world history class? Then what is your least restrictive alternative? You don't have one. Then you can't teach world history. So you see, it works. You know, it's not a bright line, but it works, this test, if you think about it. It works. Yes, Kathleen?
What about a group that says that they would like one entire religion, but not all the other religions to be extracted? Is there a compelling
They
thing?
want what?
So a group wants all of Islam to be taken out of the curriculum. Is there any, I know what you think, I know what I think. Is there some legal compelling interest that would allow them to do that?
No. So the state, like it or not, has great power when it comes to determining what goes in the curriculum. Parents have litigated this, including in Massachusetts, with the sex ed curriculum about LGBTQ issues. And Massachusetts was way out ahead on this, of putting material in the curriculum that featured LGBT stories and stuff. Well, of course, it's going to be litigated. They didn't say we want to opt out of this story. That would be different. They said we don't want anybody to read this. That's almost never going to prevail in a court of law, because the courts have recognized over time that the function of government to educate is of such a high interest that it trumps, if you will, these other claims. And they cannot shut it down for everybody. They may get an opt-out of certain portions if it's a limited, specific thing. Now, they can't just opt out every time Islam is mentioned, I don't think. I think that would fail. But if it's like when you teach about Darwin's biography, we want out. You know, we'll keep them in the biology class for evolutionary theory, you know, whatever you teach, but we don't want that particular. We don't like Darwin. Maybe. You know, it's limited, it's specific. So it's like that, but they can't say nobody should learn about Darwin, you know. No. Other things about this? So, you know, I mean, those of you in public education, I would use this. I would definitely use this, even if in your state you don't have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, because it is so important to take claims of conscience seriously, even if you don't like them. Especially if you don't like them. That's a good point. So the teacher, you know, in Tennessee all those years ago, the parent who didn't want their kid reading Wizard of Oz stories or this or that, and everybody, the media made a mockery of this poor woman. Well, I'm sorry. It does seem hard to grasp if you're not part of that, but you know what? It's a claim of conscience, for gosh sakes. And it doesn't mean she's going to win everything. It means our first duty, particularly in public education, is to say, as Buzz Thomas likes to say, put on your biggest listening ears. It's the first thing you do. And he said, tell me why. Right? And then what can I do to help you and your student? Yeah. Yeah.
And like Darwin trying to balance like evolution with his own ideas.
Yeah, and I think it's a point well taken, and I would say this, I'd say a couple of things. One, very few science classes help students understand the various religious perspectives on this, as give them context. I think they should. I think they should say, we're going to spend a day or so on how different religions understand creation and so forth, just so that we can put this class in context, and we respect that people have these different views. But we're teaching you what science. We don't do that. We teach one thing. So we're kind of left with, like, take it or leave it. So we're not like in a situation in a science class where, or even in social studies, where we're giving different multiple perspectives and they want to opt out of. No, we're giving one. So first of all, we need to cure that problem. But your point is, though, isn't that a part of a good education? And I agree with you that it is. So that's why I say that my colleagues and I in the religious liberty world say, and right and left, we say if the request has to be limited, it has to be, feasible and reasonable, right? Now, something will not be conveyed by allowing that small opt-out. That has to be balanced against whether you've really done something to protect conscience, whether you've accommodated your parents and your students. So you have to weigh, but I think as long as it's very limited, it won't hurt the curriculum that much. But all religious accommodations are going to be, we're going to take something away, right? I mean, so some kids who can't eat certain foods, and so the cafeteria labels different foods. Kids who have to miss a few minutes of class because they need to finish their prayers. Yeah, that's some disadvantage for those kids. If you add all those things up, it's true. But it doesn't rise to the level of hurting their education terribly. I mean, I think not learning, and Darwin's history maybe isn't a good example, but that one day we spent on telling Darwin's story, probably the kid will be fine, right? Yeah. Yes.
The other distinction that I thought I heard Amanda, right? I thought I heard Amanda drawing is, in kind of saying like, well, that may be what the parents want, but it's not the best thing for the kid. But I think that legally, if any of the stuff is in court, like it's the parents' decision.
Oh, right.
What
Yes.
is best
Good
for
point.
their minor child, like.
That's right.
So on some level, like a parent's free exercise rights is the kid's free exercise rights. Even if, like, okay, you get into the nitty-gritty of that family, maybe the kid's like, Mom, come on, but you have to respect the parent's voice.
That's right. And the parents are the ones who have to enforce these things, like at the cafeteria. So the teacher doesn't go down the line and knock the hot dog out of the kid's hand. That's up to the kids and the parent. So there's not that we're telling teachers to be the police, but in the curriculum situation, the teacher is the one that has to make the action. And that court case I mentioned earlier, Pierce v. Society of Sisters, it upheld the right of parents to choose whether they go to a private school or religious school. The court said exactly what Henry's saying. It said parents have the responsibility for the upbringing of their children, including education. And that's kind of been the lodestar for parental rights cases. I'll tell you something, though. Pierce v. Society of Sisters, even though it's a strong decision, parents are losing a lot of cases under it. Parental rights do not get much attention by the courts. They kind of so parents don't win a lot of these cases. They don't. So I don't know what happened to parental rights, but the courts don't seem to care. Yeah.
So this just brought to mind circumstances that's happening in my school, and I'm sorry if I'm going completely
That's fine.
tangent, but our school's really been making moves to allow more religious diversity and allowing parents to, speak on behalf of their faith and what they do in their household. We have circumstances that arise around the tradition, or that's the word, the practice of fasting, specifically because we do live in Phoenix, Arizona desert, and so our school has recently had concerns or issues between parents saying, my
That's a big,
Anybody's
that's a,
experienced that?
no, that's a very good example of the tension.
Yeah, it's been tough.
You have a compelling interest for the health and safety of children. So if a Christian Science kid is on the playground and you know that that kid cannot get medical care under their religion, but the kid falls off the jungle gym, do you still have those, or whatever it is, and is on the ground bleeding, what are you going to do? Well, what are you going to do? You're going to call 911, aren't you? Yes. You're going to call 911. You're not going to sit there saying, "Oh, I'm going to let the kid bleed because of, religious accommodation." You're going to save that kid. Get him medical attention. And you can deal with the consequences later with the parents. So, yes, in some circumstances, you have to make choices in the interest of the kid. I don't know in that case whether that would rise to that level, because if the child doesn't go outside during the day, if they're in air conditioning, well, then that's on them. So what I would say is that the school can put some conditions. You can't go outside, even though the other kids get to go outside. You have to stay in. No court in the land is going to say send the kid outside without water in 116-degree weather. At the same time, the court might say, well, wait a minute. If the kid is in air conditioning all day, what's it to you? You can't force that kid not to practice the faith. So I think that's the thing. Schools can draw lines, but I don't think they can say, because we think it's in the best interest of the kid to drink water during the day, whether they go outside or not, we're going to do that. Or get medical care if it's a Christian Science, even if it's not an emergency. If it's not an emergency, you cannot do that. Like aspirin or whatever. I don't know what the example would be. You can't do that. Yeah.
So I'm in a Catholic school, and I teach comparative world religions, and there are people that enroll and say, if I give you $5,000 more, can my kid be exempt from religion class? We don't believe any of that crap anyway.
They really offer you $5,000?
You personally.
Oh, no. We do that in my government college again. Because I pay. I teach the bar. But here's the thing. So we do not exempt any child from any religious courses that's in our mission statement, etc., except our international students. When I teach Buddhism, they, for 2 weeks, have to find somewhere else to be. If they call home and ask their parents if they're from China, here's the curriculum, and we send them the curriculum, and that's not the same history that's taught there. So about the Dalai Lama and the monks, and so they have to be excused. And like Amanda was saying, it's really hard for me. I've only had one student in 11 years from China that stayed in the classroom, and he's still in contact with me saying, okay, did you know this is crazy, but they teach us totally different. And wherever he's at now, I don't know. But we do not exempt anybody, but when it comes to our international students, we bow to whatever, it comes back to the parents. You get the parent on the phone, my child can't be in there watching that propaganda, is usually is what it's called. And like, okay.
Yeah, and you have scope to do that, for better or for worse. You have scope to say, we're going to make this accommodation over here, but we're not going to do it over here. And then there's only the pressure of your parents, and if the parents organize or, want to boycott the school, there are reasons why the school may change, but the school didn't have to, because there would be a First Amendment issue, of course, if it were a public school. There'd be a bunch of them. But in a private school, no. If on the condition of taking international students, this is, we're going to make these accommodations,